say it again.
Yes. Hi, everybody. We hope you're feeling good. Hope everybody at your house is healthy. And should we do a shout out?
Yes.
To Bryn and Callie and Carter and Morgan and Silas. How are ya? And Joey, we're going to send this to you just in case someday we do math. And it's not going to be today, though. And siblings. What siblings do we have again? We've got Emma and Eli and Layla and Callie. I think you have a little sister, but I don't know her name. Carter, I don't know your little sister's name either. But, all right, I hope everybody's doing great. We want to continue the story that we were on. It is called, as I get my glasses on, My Life with the Indians, An Incredible Journey, The True Story of Mary Jemison. And I'm going to show you, we're a little bit closer today, so hopefully you can see pictures better. And I'm going to give you a run through of the story, pictures that we saw already with the story. This is that 80-year-old woman who sat down in 1823 to tell her story. And there she is, living life happily with her family in their little cabin. And then the first day when the Indians barged in, totally unexpected, and her whole family became captives.
Bad old people.
Well, we find out that they're not always bad. And here they're being led away by the Indians. And you can see her holding her mama's hand here. This is kind of a sad shot as her mommy says goodbye to her. And here she's being led to a fort with her captors. And remember in the corner up there we saw some moccasins. You remember how they were decorated? They were decorated with glass beads and what else? Porcupine quills. Do you remember that?
That's cool.
I would love to see those. And here she is journeying on in a canoe down a river. And remember, she saw something, don't say it, she saw something very sad on the way. But then when she reached her destination, there was a celebration, and these two women from a Seneca tribe adopted her. You can see down in the corner here, they're piercing her ears as part of the adoption ceremony.
Why did they do that?
And if you look up close, here's a map about some of their journeys. You can see a couple of the Great Lakes in New York State. Lake Erie, Lake Ontario, tail little piece of Lake Huron. And that red line shows you the journey that she went on. And now we come to where we're beginning today, called the New Beginning. All right, so those were lots of ideas for things to be drawing in your black composition books. Don't forget you should say a couple things about each picture that you draw and make sure that you're drawing every day. So a new beginning. In the 3rd year of my captivity, my sisters announced that they had arranged for me to marry a warrior named Shenaji of the Delaware Nation. At first, the thought of marrying an Indian, it repelled me. But I obeyed my sister's wishes, and soon I learned that the man that they had chosen for me was good-natured, he was generous, and he was tender. As time went on, I came to love him, and I found him to be an agreeable husband and a very pleasant companion. I later gave birth to my first child, a girl, but to my sadness, she died almost immediately. A year later, I delivered a healthy son, whom I named Thomas Jemison, in memory of my father. But on the heels of that happy event, Shenaji died of an illness, and he left me a widow. My sisters came to my aid again, and they found me a new husband, an excellent Seneca man, whom I would be married to for over 50 years. His name was Hiokatu. With him I had 2 sons and 4 daughters. I named them John and Jessie, Nancy, Betsy, Jane, and Polly, in remembrance of the family that I had lost. After the British defeated the French in 1763, we lived in happiness and peace for 15 years. During this time, Hiokatu and I moved our family up to the northern Seneca country, up along the Genesee River, just south of Niagara. There, along the curve of the river in the great Genesee Valley, we settled in Little Beardstown, the largest and finest of the Seneca villages. This was no cluster of huts in the woods. This was a real town, with over 100 well-made log houses laid out neatly along the main road. Each house was surrounded by flowers and gardens and fruit trees. Our cherry and apple orchards were heavy with fruit. Out beyond the houses were fertile fields of corn and beans and squash, and beyond those fields lay lush grasslands where we grazed our cattle. And beyond that were the green glades of forest where we went to collect firewood and hickory nuts and maple syrup. A person could not help being happy in this environment, living there on that fair land. Our wants were few and they were easily satisfied, and I was surrounded by friends and family. I'm going to show you the picture, and then I want us to count those kind of layers of land that she talks about. All right, so let's see. They're not really layers because they're not on top of each other, but they keep extending out. She explains what's around her. It's no cluster of huts, but it's a real town. So there's log houses, and those are surrounded by flowers and gardens and fruit trees. Out beyond there were fertile fields of corn and beans and squash. And beyond that was lush grasslands where they grazed their cattle. And beyond that were the green glades of the forest. So that was 5 different areas out from their home that she describes and what it was. So that would even be a fun picture someday. The question of choice. During those years, I was given several opportunities to return to my own people. But after careful consideration, I decided to remain with my Indian friends. To anyone who has never lived among the Seneca, this may seem strange, but I felt that I was no longer a captive. I had become a Seneca woman, just as much as if I had been born a Seneca woman. At Little Beardstown, I met for the first time other people who were white and had been absorbed into the bosom of Seneca life. These were men and women who had been born French, British, or Dutch, but who considered themselves and their children to be Seneca as well. After the war with the French was over, some of the captives were ransomed, but they went back only with the greatest reluctance. A good number of them tried to resume their old lives, but they soon became disgusted and returned to us, becoming Indians for the rest of their lives. In the 69 years that I have been among the Indians, I have seen many Europeans become Indians, but I have not known a single Indian who was willingly choosing to live in the white world. This may sound curious, but it is true. I cannot say why others chose to live as Indians, but I can tell you my reasons. First and foremost was my concern for my children. They were well loved here and well cared for among the Seneca. I knew that if I took them back into white society, they would be despised and hated. I also knew that my life back among the British would not be so easy or so agreeable. Seneca women enjoy much more freedom and control over their own lives than their sisters in the white world. Women hold an important and honored place among the Indians. It is the women who raise the children and grow the maize, which is corn. It is the women who can remove chiefs who are not fulfilling their duties. It is the women who are sought for advice and counsel when the great Iroquois Confederacy meets. If a woman is killed, the blood money that must be paid is twice what it would be if the victim were a man. It is important that you understand that the Indians are not savages, just like my mother called them. They are a moral and an upstanding people with all the feelings and emotions of their white brethren. It is true that they can be cruel and brutal in times of war, but many captives were not killed. They were adopted and they were absorbed into the life stream of the nation. In this way, the Indians were able to replace members that they had lost through war or disease. And once you are adopted into their tribe, nothing is denied to you. In times of peace, no one can live more happily or more harmoniously than the Indians. They love their land, their forests and their meadows, the animals and plants, and the wind and the weather.
Oh, wait. Doesn't it say something about God in it?
Well, it was about their God, so I didn't read it.
Ah.
Winds of change. But the winds of change were coming. They were blowing, and rumbling storm clouds of war were in our direction. Just as the French and the British had fought over the land years before, the British king and the American colonies were now preparing to fight over the same land again. Representatives from the colonies called a great council with 6 nations of the Iroquois Confederacy and asked us to make a treaty promising that we would be neutral in the coming war.
What is neutral?
It means you don't pick a side. You stay out of the war. Our chiefs agreed, for that was the will of the people. They did not want to take sides. Then a year later, the British commissioners came to us and requested our help in subduing the American rebels. Our chiefs said they would not violate the treaty that they had made with the people of the colonies. But the British entreated our warriors with rum and plied them with arguments and with gifts. In the end, our men did agree to the British. The British assured our men that the rebels were weak and small in number and could be easily defeated. To prove their point, they invited our warriors to the battle over Fort Stanwix, not to fight, but simply to sit and smoke and look on as the British Army whipped those American rebels. But they did not simply sit and look on. Instead, they were obliged to fight for their lives. There was a great deal of crying in our town after that battle. This was the beginning of a time that was very bad for us.
Ooh, that's sad.
It is sad. They wanted to remain what? Remember that word that you asked about? They didn't want to take sides. They wanted to remain neutral. And instead, they were talked into becoming part of the battle. And they did not expect that. And here's a picture.
Should you please stay with us?
It's okay. For 4 or 5 years, the war dragged on. But the real fighting was going on 100 miles south and east of us. Then, in the autumn of 1779, our scouts received word that a 5,000-man rebel army, led by General John Sullivan, was sweeping through the Iroquois land, burning all the towns and villages. On the morning when Sullivan's army came into our valley, swift Seneca runners came through the town, shouting for the women and the children to take to the hills, shouting that the men should prepare to fight. Knowing that I might never see my husband again, I gathered a few blankets and provisions and set off for the woods. It took 3 days for the army to reduce Little Beard's town to a smoking rubble. There was no way they could prevent such a large force from sweeping over us. So we did the only thing we could do. We abandoned our town and watched from the hills as it burned and ravaged. Hiokatu, her husband, immediately slung his quiver of war arrows onto his back and stuck his war club into his belt. He took the nuggets of charcoal from the fire and began to blacken his face. That was the tradition for warriors. After the army moved on, we returned to the ashes of our town, and we found that the soldiers had ruined everything they could lay their hands on. They had torn up our gardens, chopped down our trees, and killed our cattle. Half of our corn had been piled inside our houses, and then the buildings had been set on fire. The other half they threw into the river. Search as we might, we could not find a single handful of food. The winter was moving in quickly, and my children were hungry and cold. Some of our people went north to winter with the British at Fort Niagara, and some went west and lived on the charity of our neighboring tribes, and others just scattered and died in the cold forest. I was going to go north, hoping to meet Hiokatu at the fort, where I remembered an abandoned log cabin that I had once seen at a place called Gardeau Flats along the Genesee River, a few miles south of the town. I thought that I might survive the winter there. But the cabin was not abandoned. Instead, I found the cabin occupied by 2 former slaves who had escaped. They had escaped from their masters and taken up residence there on the flats. When they saw my frozen and weary children, they offered to share their shelter with us. Later that night, they explained that they had planted a large field of crop corn along the river and needed help harvesting that crop. I readily agreed, and we struck up a bargain. In return for husking their corn, I could have a portion of the harvest. When the work was done, I had earned 25 bushels of shelled corn. That was enough to feed my children until the spring. The weather during our first winter at Gardeau was severe. The snow was 5 feet deep, and the cold was like nothing I had experienced before or since. But somehow, my children and I struggled through. In fact, I planted and I hoed corn there for 3 years, working with the other 2 men. And when they decided to move on and left me and my children as the sole occupants of the flats, to my great joy, Hiokatu returned to us, and we were once again a family.
Yay! That's a happy scene.
There's a real small picture of the original cabin that they were just talking about. So here it is as a picture that you could draw. And it's probably hard to see, but here's the actual cabin. And this is in upstate New York where we're reading about. And I grew up in upstate New York, probably about 3 hours from where they're talking about. But where I grew up, we had 5 feet of snow all winter too. And it was a really long winter.
Well,
So when she talks about it, what?
Not me. I'm the one that...
Yeah, you're a Jersey girl. Natalie's a Jersey girl.
She always gets me mixed up. And
No, me. I
I
grew up.
know. And you always tell everybody that I was from upstate New York. And I'm like,
You're right. I'm from upstate New York. And her daddy is from upstate New York. But Natalie's a Jersey girl. Just like you guys. All right. We stayed at the Gardeau Flats. The land was extremely fertile, but needed more labor than my children and I could supply. So I began leasing portions of the flats to white settlers who lived and worked on the land as tenants. And this was a good arrangement. My land was well cared for, and my children grew like tall corn. When the war ended in 1783, My family was firmly established on the flats. At the Council of Big Tree in 1797, the Seneca formally granted me a deed for my land. It has ever since been known as the Gardeau Tract. The Indians were of the opinion that the land had been cleared by some ancient race of people who had lived on and tilled that land long before the Seneca had come to this part of the country. I was never able to solve this mystery. I only knew that our fields had been planted and hoed for many years. Gardeau was good to me in those years. Even as I became older, my health remained excellent and my mind was clear. My children grew up. They married and they lived nearby, making me a grandmother. But life's sweetest moments are often crowned with tragedy. As my sons grew to manhood, all three of them learned to drink liquor and often became quarrelsome. My boys were not the only ones who fell under the spell of this drink. Many unscrupulous white traders supplied the Indians with alcohol, knowing that they had no resistance to this unfamiliar drink. They knew that, like the diseases that came among the Seneca, drinking would rob these warriors of their strength and of their pride. After the war, many of the Indian men, our Indian men, and some of the women as well, would gather for rowdy drinking parties. When their tempers became inflamed with this strange drink, they would often become spiteful with one another. Fights would break out, and many an Indian woke up from his binge the next morning to find that he had killed a trusted friend or relative.
Oy.
Even my boys would drink and fight with each other.
Ooh.
Then, on a terrible day in July 1811, my oldest son Thomas and his younger brother John got into a drunken argument while they were visiting my house. In a fit of fury, John snatched up one of my wood axes and struck Thomas a sharp blow on the side of the head. Thomas fell and died right there on the doorstep of my house. He was then 52 years old, the father of many children, and John was 48. Because he had acted in self-defense, the chiefs acquitted John of his brother's murder. That means he was not held responsible. It wasn't long before trouble erupted again, and this time between John and my youngest son Jesse. During another drunken argument, with his hands already stained with the blood of his older brother, John killed Jesse. John's tormented life ended 2 years later when he was killed by two Indians who had been drinking at that time. They were in the woods. I had buried 3 sons. They were snatched from me by the hand of violence at a time when I least expected it. To have a child die is a mother's greatest fear, but to have them kill one another, that was too much. It strained my heart to breaking. As a final blow, my good husband Hiokatu died, and at that advanced age of 103.
Wow.
Once again, I was a widow on this earth, but this time with grandchildren to feed. Even though my heart was broken into pieces, my body had to keep on going. The bounty of my land provided me and for my grandchildren, and somehow we survived. Prayer for the future. My story is almost over, and there's not much more I can tell you. I know that in many ways I have been a very lucky woman. I could have been killed by the Shawnee when I was 15 years old, but my life was spared. That small gift of moccasins so long ago, I have always been grateful for that. When I began my new life as a Seneca woman, I was able to see the land when it was green and growing, and when the people were happy and whole, before they became weakened by disease and drink, before the talons of war tore the great Iroquois Confederacy apart. I still say the prayers that my mother taught me. I have continued to pray to my childhood God. But sometimes my heart, which has suffered so many hardships and disappointments, opens right up, and a greater prayer comes forth. A prayer bigger than even the one my mother taught me way back on Marsh Creek. I pray that our children's children's children will look back on these years of war and bloodshed, and that they will shake their heads at our foolishness and ignorance. I pray that someday our children, both Indian and white, will clasp hands in friendship and set about the hard work of healing the wounds that we have dealt one another. Then, perhaps, the land will once again ring with the happy voices of our children. Perhaps then the council fires will be relit, and the people will gather and sit beside one another, letting their prayers rise up and touch the heavens. Perhaps then the story I have told will really mean something. Here's a statue that's in a park, Letchworth State Park. And that's up in New York State. In the autumn of 1833, Mary Jemison died quietly in her cabin at the Genesee, surrounded by her family. She was 90 years old. Today, the Senecas still live on that land that they had inhabited since ancient times. And just as Mary Jemison had hoped, the council fires have been relit. The great Confederacy of the Iroquois has reformed and is now struggling with its own questions. How can the Iroquois live alongside the white world without being imprisoned by it? The answer is still in the wind. But just as Grandmother Jemison predicted, one by one, Indian and white people are clasping hands in friendship and beginning the slow, difficult work of building bridges between two very different cultures. This book is one of many small steps in that direction. I'm just going to read one little part. Seneca history. Mary Jemison witnessed one of the most dramatic and heartbreaking chapters in American history. In the space of a single lifetime, she saw the northeastern region of North America taken from the control of the ancient Indian peoples and settled by European soldiers, farmers, and entrepreneurs. The story of this conquest is long and complicated. But it gives us a good idea about what it was like to be an Indian. It's really interesting to think that this woman who was a captive became part of that Indian culture so much that even when she had a chance to go back to her white culture, she chose to remain an Indian. And she explained her reasons for that. She had children, and she knew that her children would be happiest in that Indian culture, where she was afraid if she had gone back to the white culture, people would have not liked her children. People would have maybe been afraid of her children because they were Indian, or disliked them because they were Indians. We don't even think about the